Hello everybody, welcome back Psych and Law. Annika and I are going to get busy here. We're going to talk about psychologists in the legal system. 4 basic roles. Again, what we're looking at then is an extension almost of the Holy Trinity, which you guys are going to get in lecture 2.1, and there's assignment connected to the Holy Trinity. Here what we're talking about is 3 major roles plus a 4th. And the difficulty that these roles present in terms of role conflict. So let us just then, in fact, get started moving through here. The 4 basic roles and the 3 you see will conform very much to the Holy Trinity. The 4th is kind of an add-on. But let's talk about psychologists in the legal system first and foremost as basic scientists. And what do basic scientists do? They're interested in knowledge for their own sake. And as I got further on in college, especially when I was in my junior year and I started working in research labs at UCI, and then certainly when I got to graduate school, it fascinated me. My second advisor, Marilyn Brewer, my first advisor, Phil Tetlock, was my advisor for about 3 years, and then he left to go to Berkeley to run the Haas Business School. He asked if I wanted to go, but I declined. I wanted to stay at Ohio State and do my social psychology thing. So I walked down the hallway and knocked on Marilyn Brewer's door and said, "Marilyn, are you willing to be my advisor?" And she said, "Sure." And you know, Marilyn has a long history in social psychology, but in our research meetings, it just astounded me that when people tossed out a theory or an idea, like Marilyn was almost, you know, it was almost like raw meat to a wolf, that I would watch these professors just tear into these ideas and turn them inside out on their heads. What's it like? How does it differ? And it's knowledge for their own sake. They just get turned on by thinking, right? And there's actually a measure of that. Does anyone know the measure that determines how much you like to think? It was developed at Ohio State in the social psychology department. It's called need for cognition. And a basic scientist generally has a pretty high need for cognition. They like to think, and they like to think about ideas, right? They don't necessarily seek to apply their findings. They just like to do the heavy lifting of thinking about it. Heavily invested in the scientific method. Oh my God, Marilyn taught our graduate level methods class. Our first class that we took in graduate school was methods with Marilyn. She's written a book on methods, and everything is about methodology. And when you think about it, when we look at some of our college careers, I don't know, what have I had? 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different methods classes, and probably twice as many statistics classes, right? Because that's how we convert opinion to fact. Is we start with a theory, we develop testable hypotheses, we test them, and we analyze the results statistically. Hey, Penelope, where did Annika go? Well, Penelope's here with us now. So, heavily invested in the scientific method, and for people who haven't been trained in the scientific method, they often really don't understand the difference between hypothesis testing, providing evidence, and how that's so much better than simply stopping at opinion. Opinion's a great place to start. Opinion's a great way to develop hypotheses. But testable hypotheses, but opinion's just the beginning. It's not the end point, at least not for some of us, right? We see that basic scientists typically work in academic environments. That's where they're most comfortable. That's where they get paid to do their research. And can be paid quite well for that, at least some of them. So, what are the ethical considerations for a basic scientist? Well, we know that all proposed studies got to be submitted to the IRB for an ethical review. And especially social psychology has a pretty sketchy history, right, of ethical dealings. You can look back at Zimbardo with his Stanford prison experiments. I'll call them demonstrations because they weren't necessarily experiments. We look at Stanley Milgram, and was his work ethical, right? We go way back, John Watson as an experimental behaviorist. Was it ethical to make little Albert scared of white furry objects? God, let's hope not, right? So, the IRB then tells you whether your study design passes muster and whether you can conduct it or not. And every year it gets a little more stringent and a little more strict, and we demonstrate a greater and greater concern for our human participants, right? So even for minimally intrusive studies, right, their review process can take at least a month, and that's short, right, maybe for expedited review. When I was doing my dissertation research, I was about 8 months of going back and forth with the IRB before they finally gave me approval to do my study. So, and if you want to know what that was, you got to take Psych of Emotion. Yeah, I'm going to do that to you. So, must be objective when gathering and evaluating data. And that is, you want your study to work, right? And often there's a lot of pressure to publish. You want your study to work, but somehow, some way, you have to remain objective and let the data do the speaking, right? And if the data doesn't support the hypothesis, then guess what? Back to square one, right? So, can't create favorable data, although some people have, and there's been some people throughout time who have created data. With a peer review system, we often, though, catch people who've made up data, and they are essentially forced out of the business. One of my competitors in the study of non-conscious emotion, a guy named Stoppel, who was in the Netherlands, had a long career, and at some point it was pointed out, someone found out that he had been making up his data at some point. And what happens when he's making up his data? Well, guess what? He had to pay the price, and he lost his job, and his publications were retracted. Sorry for the weird-ass technical glitch there. I run the camera off my iPad, you know, and boy, it just stopped. The iPad just crapped out, so I wasn't sure whether we were recording or not, and best to start over again. I'll tell you, I have recorded way too many lectures that didn't get recorded and had to do them over and over and over again. So I'm going to stop and double check before I sit there and do half an hour's worth of work and have it not work well. So you can't create favorable data, and the whole idea of peer review is to kind of prevent that from happening. Now, let's talk about the next step as psychologists apply to scientists, right? They apply research, often basic research, which is generated by the basic scientist, to real-world problems. And in this case, they can be clinicians, so clinicians will deal with clients, and they're using clinical theory that was probably developed by basic scientists, right? They can be counselors, and you know, counseling is often thought of clinician light, if you will. They can be expert witnesses. So when I'm now using what's been found in basic research, like how a lineup was conducted, which is something that was tested in the laboratory, let's say, to assess eyewitness identification accuracy using different types of lineup techniques. We can conduct that basic research in the laboratory, but then as an applied scientist, then I might walk into the courtroom and be asked to comment upon the specific lineup for the defendant in this particular case. So expert witnesses are often taking basic scientist findings and applying them with, let's say, in a courtroom setting. And consultants, and jury consultants would be one that we would think of in the context of this course. What do we know about jury decision making that was done in the laboratory, and then how do we apply it to jury selection processes, for example? So, now the psychologist is a policy evaluator. The third element, they assess the efficacy of interventions and the effectiveness. One thing that you'll find for many of us that come out of school with our bachelor's degrees, you know, as kind of our starting point, is we have a tremendous amount of methodology and maybe data analysis statistics under our belt. Often we're really well qualified to engage in evaluation processes within a company, within a corporation, or within a government agency. So, then prepare reports, recommendations to institutions after having evaluated a policy. So the relationship of these three types of psychologists, and I want to put in this graphic here, we see that the basic research in the lower left box, right, that's what they do, is they create those basic research findings, and then that feeds, right, the policy creators, people who want to modify or change existing policy. These people are often responsible for conducting needs assessments. Did the policy need to be revised, changed, or modified, right? And then we go to the third box, which is to evaluate or assess, and that's the effectiveness of the intervention and report. So the relationship of these three types of psychologists, right, somewhat parallels the Holy Trinity that we're going to discuss in the next lecture. So let us then look at the roles of these psychologists in a tad more detail. So the expert witness, they take knowledge from their field and they use it in real-world situations for real problems. Okay. Gary Wells was instrumental in getting police departments through the Department of Justice to change their lineup procedures to reduce the number of false identifications, right? So especially clinical, counseling, school, industrial, organizational, developmental psychologists, these are all people who can operate as applied psychologists. Many of you might want to become school psychologists, and what you're going to do, part of what you're going to do is design individual education programs for individual students, right? Well, this is based on scientific research and often in terms of best practices, right? Psychologists can be both basic and applied, but I'm going to toss out some caveats regarding that here in a little bit. In legal settings, psychologists are most often called as unbiased expert witnesses for attorneys or judges. And we got to think about this role, psychologists as expert witnesses. From what I understand, this pays big money to come in and be an expert witness, right? Now, the testimony that they can give really falls into three categories. And it might help then to envision these categories as going from general to increasingly specific. The social authority type of testimony from an expert witness is where a psychologist might give general information in a written brief that's designed to change or inform the law. And I'll have an example of that. This is often an amicus curiae, which is friend to the court. It's a brief that's prepared to help judges make decisions on influential cases that have come to the bench, right? Often Supreme Court will get a lot of these briefs that help inform them about what is known about the processes on which they're ruling. Brown versus Board of Education is the example I'll show you as we move through this. That is separate, and we talked about this before, separate is equal. Well, psychologists took the opinion that maybe separate can't ever be equal. More on that in a bit. Now, the social framework and the social facts, let's take those both on the next slides here. So social framework, more specific, right, than social authority. Information on a specific topic relevant to a case, but not giving judgments about the specific case facts. So in this, I might then talk about the general pervasiveness of sexual discrimination and the general effects on people who are discriminated against or people who are conducting that discrimination, right? So general characteristics of abused children might be something that I would talk about in court at the level of social framework, right? That we see anxiety, and anxiety can present itself in these different forms. But I'm not talking about this specific child in this specific case necessarily. Or maybe components of battered wife syndrome. To give, let's say, inform the jury of the general phenomenon. Now, social facts is when we get down to the nitty-gritty. So here we're talking about actually specific application to address the case facts that we're considering. Like, how was this specific lineup conducted, and what might that mean in terms of probability of eyewitness being mistaken, for example? Or how was the interrogation conducted if I want to, let's say, necessarily impeach the contents of this interrogation, then I'll talk specifically about this interrogation of this defendant exceeded this amount of time and denied this specific defendant the access to an attorney or the restroom or whatever it is at this point in time. But notice when we get to social facts, we're talking about the facts of the case, specifically this case. So, in this case, how is publicity for the trial prejudicial? Right? And this can be quite extensive in its discussion. Think way back to the first OJ trial where this was a frickin' nightmare. Okay? Now, expert witnesses aren't regular witnesses. So when you think, and often it's tempting for us to carry our education that was created by television. For those of you who love court cases on TV, etc., we learn a bunch of things in watching, and some is accurate, some is not, right? Expert witnesses, they can give opinions, right? Especially in social facts testimony, where normal witnesses cannot. And if a regular witness starts to give an opinion, then there will likely be an objection from an attorney. Social opinions are allowed by experts to a certain extent. They can also answer hypothetical questions. So this is going beyond what was observed to what it might mean hypothetically, right? Now, laws about expert testimony. The Fry standard is used in some states. And let me say this right now. I am a psychologist, specifically a social psychologist. I am not an attorney. So as we start to move into specifics about the law, we see my knowledge get a little less firm, right? And if you want, this is, I have not been to law school. Almost went, but have not been to law school, so we begin to tread lightly when I move into these areas. The example that why I'm saying this now is Fry standards used by some states. Which states and to what extent? I can't comment on that. Now, I understand the Fry standard fine, and I can talk about that. But when we talk about the specifics of how it was used, to what extent, in which states, that's for another instructor to deal with. Now, the U.S. versus Fry was an interesting case. It came in 1923, and really the question was about new testimony from a new device during a case. And in this case, what they said is, hey, look, we have this new machine called a polygraph, and it can tell whether somebody's lying or not. And now you can imagine, for the first time, they say, what do you mean there's a machine that can tell whether someone's lying or not? How can we rely on this machine? How do we know if it's accurate? And now the battle over this testimony, this potential testimony, ensues in the court. And basically, U.S. versus Fry is saying, look, are we going to allow polygraph testimony as an evaluation of truth or what is false in the courtroom? And the U.S. versus Fry standard set up a precedent, and that is, this is the way we will evaluate all future evidence within these jurisdictions. What does it mean to be acceptable testimony from an expert witness in court? Well, Fry set these standards, right? You need to know this. So, testimony must be widely accepted within the scientific community, right? With little or no disagreement. And at this point, when they did this, lie detection was a new science, and people are saying, no, way too many people don't trust this. And the studies that promote lie detection are not necessarily well conducted, nor are they reliable. So, what is the disadvantage? Well, it excludes cutting-edge research. So here's a brand new device, the polygraph, but we're not going to allow evidence generated by a polygraph. Now, the Daubert system came later, and this is Daubert versus Merrill Dow Pharmaceuticals, is used by some states. It's also used by the federal government. Now, Daubert, what does it say? Well, it was a case about drugs causing birth defects. And from Daubert, what we see is the testimony must meet 4 criteria for it to be allowed in a court, a federal court, or a state court that uses the Daubert standard. What are these 4 elements then? Well, it must be based on the scientific method. So it has to go through, it has to pass the bar in terms of legitimate hypothesis testing and analysis, right? So it's based on objective hypothesis testing. It must contain data that's reasonably relied upon by other experts. So if we look at my dissertation, when I was trying to develop non-conscious emotions, I was also trying to measure non-conscious emotions, which had not yet been done before. So my measures for non-conscious emotions might not be considered reliable when, you know, enough scientists step back and take a look at it. They say, well, this is new, and I don't know if I buy that, right? And then it's been through peer review and publication. And this is one of the safeguards, right, to show that it's a legitimate process. The problem with Daubert, now judges have to be the gatekeepers, decide what's good science despite no scientific training. And let's think about this. Most judges certainly have been to school, and what are their degrees? Well, most judges have been to law school. They haven't been trained necessarily in the scientific method. They're extremely well trained in legal context. So, but now we're asking a judge, hey, was this a correctly generated hypothesis? Is this tested properly? And then we can start, you know, thinking in terms of internal validity of the study, reliability of the data analysis, and those are probably beyond the scope of knowledge of people who've been simply to law school, right? And that's not to insult people who've been to law school. It's just not what they were trained in. So it's difficult because we're asking judges to maybe do something that they're not entirely skilled at. Okay? Now, Daubert's, we have already said that Daubert is used by the federal government in some states. Okay, so ethics for applied scientists, they must be just as objective as the basic scientists, no matter who's paying them. Now, let's move into the real world for just a moment. Let's suppose that I decide, hey, this teaching thing, it's been enough of that. I want to start working as an expert witness, so I go out and start selling my services to attorneys, etc., law firms. What do you think? If an attorney, if we need testimony that helps to exonerate a client, and I provide testimony that does the opposite, what's the likelihood that that law firm will employ me in the future? We paid that guy $10,000 to give his expert testimony, and all it did was help convict our client. I'm not going to work. Not very long, right? And this is problematic because what we're asking people to do is, hey, you want to make great money at this career, right? And teaching is peanuts, right? Offering expert testimony is big bucks. So I'm like, yeah, am I truly going to say what I think, or am I going to say what the law firm is paying me to say? Right? So we're often pushed to give black and white statements, but scientists rarely have black and white answers, and social psychologists are some of the worst in this regard in talking about terms of probability. And, you know, social psychologists use the world in terms of probability. Well, the likely outcome, you know, I conducted this study, and what I found in this condition, 66% of my participants, well, think about it, the Milgram study. 66 participants, what did they do? Come here, Quincy. 66 participants shocked the learner all the way to the maximum shock level of 450 volts, 66%. So if you ask me, well, do you think that this defendant would have went all the way or would go all the way given the opportunity? And I would say, well, you know, there's probably a 66% chance that they would. And they say, no, you don't understand the question. We're asking you about this defendant. I'm like saying, well, I don't know about this defendant. People on average, 66%, and notice that's not really helpful in the context of the court case. What everyone wants to know is, what about this person, this defendant, right, Quincy? This is our big boy. Yeah. So, rarely black and white answers. We often talk about probabilistic answers, and if we're really fancy, we say, well, in this context, this is likely to happen. In this other context, that's more likely to happen. But it's not gratifying responses for the attorneys, the jurors, or the judge. So, this leads to a tension then between legal professionals and scientists, because they want me to commit. Especially if they paid me $10,000 to testify. They don't want this kind of waffling proposal proportional kind of answer. They want specifics that actually enhance the ability of their client to be found not guilty. Or prosecutors are looking for me to seal the deal and have the jurors come back with a guilty verdict. So tough ethical bind, and probably the most questionable of the bunch. Now, as I said earlier, our statistical training gives us a tremendous potential to evaluate policies, to set up survey instruments, to collect the data, to analyze the data, and write meaningful reports to inform people of what the data says. So we got these skills. I mean, this is something that we leave school with first and foremost. If you're worried about, oh, I've got a degree in psychology or sociology or criminal justice, and then what am I going to do with that? Well, you got data analytic and you got hypothesis testing skills. So good start, right? Many legal policies, guidelines can benefit from psychological expertise and assessment. Are you going to knock this whole thing over? Huh? Now you know why I have this TV screen bungee corded, because he wants to push it down. So, mandatory minimum sentences, are they effective? Allowing jurors to take notes, treatments for sex offenders, etc. Think about what we see right now. We got a bunch of people. We had this crazy-ass extremist insurrection at the Capitol building. We have armed people taking over a government building with what looks to be the intent to do serious harm to the people inside that building. I don't know why you go in with zip ties, handcuffs, etc., if you're not intending to take people hostage, right? And now the big question is, well, what should we do? Should we come down hard on these people, or should we just say, oh well? I'll tell you what we know and what is the policy that we should take towards insurrectionists, people who are going against the government. Well, a lot of us think, hey, yeah, they should be put on trial, and if they're found guilty, then they should be punished to the full extent of the law. Other people are suggesting, oh no, we kind of just have to look the other way and forget, because if we punish these people, then they're going to become even more violent. So we're really on the brink we're teetering around these policies. How should we handle this situation? Well, I mean, as a policy evaluator, first of all, as a basic scientist, I would go back to B.F. Skinner and operant conditioning. If you want people to not repeat a behavior, then it's probably best to apply punishment. If you want people to continue a behavior, then you do nothing or you reward, right? And so what are we going to do? Now, other issues might be treatment for sex offenders. What works, what doesn't? And policy evaluators would step in and design ways to understand this. Sometimes policy makers won't listen to policy evaluators. No one was ready to listen to Zimbardo about the assumption of roles as causing conflict and causing observed behavioral changes merely by placing someone in a role. Or Stanley Milgram's experiment. What happens, if people are given, instructions from an authority figure that they deem legitimate? Will they cause pain to another person? So a lot of times people don't listen. Sometimes they do, right? Now, psychologist then as the policy evaluator. When we see Gary Wells, test all these different lineup procedures and go to the Department of Justice, and he presents the data and he says, look, we can reduce misidentification by significant percentages. In fact, policy evaluators did then adopt many of Gary Wells' guidelines for improving the quality of eyewitness testimony and identification of criminal suspects. So ethics for the policy evaluator, like the expert witness, they may feel pressure to interpret their findings based on who's paying. I remember when I was at the second paper mill, when I was at the Wallula paper mill, and I had moved up into quality control, and I was kind of the data analyst for the mill. And mill managers expected a monthly report on quality data, but also special reports testing certain aspects. And I remember there was one issue with the number one paper machine. There was 3 paper machines in the paper mill. The number one was the big machine that made copy paper, huge machine, right? And they spent $350,000 on this new slice. It's the lip where the paper liquid pulp actually comes out onto the screen. It's not yet paper, but it will be by the time it exits the machine. And they wanted to show increased quality improvements as the result of putting this new $350,000 slice in. Well, I remember the paper machine superintendent coming to me and said, "Mark, I suppose the data shows that this was a successful modification to the machine." And I'm like, well, I haven't done it. And he says, "Yeah, I know you haven't finished the analysis yet, but I assume that the data will support having put that new slice in." And I'm like, ooh, what do I want to do about this? So you may then report the data in a way that achieves the preferred conclusion, especially if someone above you is asking for given results, right? But what if a policy evaluator, let's take another kind of weird situation. If a policy evaluator runs a study with a control group and a new intervention, and the intervention works well. So let's suppose we've planned this 6-month trial on a cancer treatment. And what we know is that this cancer has a survival rate of about 60%, which means 40% of the control group is likely to die. And what we see after 3 months is some profound success in the experimental group. We still have 3 months to go on the study. What do you do? Because if you keep people in the control group, this means that some of them are dying because they're not getting what appears to be a successful experimental treatment in the other condition. What do? Do you just stop the study and then give everyone the drug? But notice, if you stop the study, then you can't demonstrate the efficacy of the drug because you no longer have a control group. This is really a dilemma when you get right down to it. Is it unethical to keep the control group at the disadvantage? And the consensus, no, it's not unethical. It basically has to be the way it is. Notice that everyone came into the study and they agreed to be either in the control group or randomly assigned to the experimental group. It's explained what's happened. For the good of science, I mean, it's a dilemma, and you guys think about it. I don't have any kind of legitimate answer to this. Quincy, you about ready to wind this up? Here we go. The fourth role. Psychologist is the advocate. Now the gloves are off, right? And this is, they share their knowledge with a particular goal in mind. They're not even pretending to be objective. That's not the issue anymore. They are an advocate. By the definition of the word, they are advocating for this change, right? So psychologists can act as lobbyists or company employees in this advocacy role. Advocates are often activists for change in existing laws or procedures. So psychologists as advocates, their goal is to change society, take existing research evidence and use it to persuade governing bodies. We should do this, right? And the amicus curiae, as I talked about earlier, is the Friends of the Court brief. Let's look at Brown versus Education, Brown versus Board of Education, and a little completely. Okay, and here's part of the brief. This is part of the actual brief that I've just cut out, but I give you a flavor for it. Segregation of white and colored children in public schools has been detrimental effect on the colored children. The impact is greater when it has the sanction of law, for the policy of separating races is usually interpreted as denoting the inferiority of the Negro group. A sense of inferiority affects the motivations of the child to learn. Right? Segregation with the sanction of law, therefore, has a tendency to retard the educational and mental development of Negro children and to deprive them of some of the benefits they would receive in a racially integrated school system. Okay? So that's a strong statement from a group of psychologists who are advocating, right, the overturning of Brown versus Board of Education to the Supreme Court. Whatever may have been the extent of psychological knowledge at the time of Plessy versus Ferguson, and this is when we return to that idea of stare decisis, way back in 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, but it's 1954 now, and gosh darn it, we've learned a whole lot since then. Let's apply that knowledge to new cases, right? So, the finding is amply supported by modern authority, and notice social authority, that's where that term comes in. Any language in Plessy versus Ferguson contrary to this finding is rejected. And then they go on to cite and think about it. I know many of us don't like to include citations. It seems like a pain in the ass. But this is where we now point back to the basic and evaluated applied research, right? So we see a bunch of studies, effect of prejudice and discrimination on personality development, right? Or opinion and attitude, let's see, discrimination and national welfare, etc. So bunch of articles were compiled, and overall multiple sources converge on this single statement that in fact separate is not equal, separate is inherently unequal. And with Brown versus Board of Education, now that becomes the law of the land, and Plessy versus Ferguson no longer sets the precedent. Now, ethics of the advocate. Well, for example, the American Society for Trial Consultants recently developed a canon of ethics like lawyers and psychologists already have. They're required to respect jury privacy, and a lot of advocates are working in jury decision making. Ensure witness testimony is always truthful, and fully respect the procedures and regulations of the court. These are some pretty watered down ethical guidelines. In almost every context, ethical guidelines could be beefed up, and we'd be the better for it, my opinion. Okay, a few key points. Psychologists can function in several roles within the legal system. So it could be a basic scientist, could be a policy evaluator, right? Functioning in several roles, though, can create role conflict and ethical dilemma. And I'm a big fan of firewalling this shit. So if you're a basic scientist, then leave it at that. Right? And then, you know, the advocate, everyone has a different hat on, and we keep them separate. And I think that's the best, easiest way to avoid ethical dilemmas, role conflict. And one thing that we have to understand, and when we keep returning to the fourth dilemma, psychologists versus the legal system, so to speak, is psychologists can disagree. And when psychologists disagree, often it looks pretty ugly. I want you to consider the kind of social facts when we're trying to determine, is this defendant, should they be considered not guilty by reason of insanity? And let's say we have 2 or 3 psychologists working for the prosecution, and we have 3 psychologists working for the defense, and we have the 3 psychologists for the prosecution saying, no, this person can't be considered not guilty by reason of insanity because what they demonstrate falls below the criteria for that justification. Whereas the defense attorneys are prompting their psychologists to say, no, look at this person is clearly insane within the eyes of the law and can't be held responsible for their actions. What's happening when we observe this? Well, what we have is psychological scientists and psychological scientists who can't agree. And I think this is one of the most damaging and devastating situations for psychologists, because then people stand back and say, well, is psychology really a science? I mean, if you got these 3 psychologists, scientists willing to say this, and you got these 3 other psychologists willing to say that, is this a science? I mean, could you imagine, let's say, bringing in 2 different chemists and having this chemist say, this the symbol for water is H2O, and this other chemist saying, no, it isn't. We would say, well, that doesn't sound very scientific. I know that's a stupidly simple example, but the point is that when psychologists disagree in court, then it has maybe a secondary effect of eroding the public's confidence in psychology as a science. And we know psychology is a soft science. It's not the hard science of chemistry or physics, but as we become better at generating hypotheses, testing hypotheses, and especially communicating research findings, hopefully we'll lessen the public's mistrust of psychologists when they observe disagreement. And they'll understand that disagreement is normal, and it really is a matter of context to determine which case is probably the stronger case. Regardless, let us try to keep these people in their own individual, one of the 3 or 4 roles, and not have role conflict and dilemmas. And I hope that as we wind this out, you as psychologists, which is probably 80-90% of the students in this class, as potential psychologists, there's a lot of opportunity for a psychologist within the legal system. So let's call it good, and have a great day.